Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. Today it is time for part 4 of Sean Schick's life of William Tecumseh Sherman. This will be the final video in this series. Last time, Sherman was able to capture Atlanta and then decided to march to the sea and march through the Carolinas, thus depriving the enemy of their lines of communication and supply, causing mass desertions in Lee's army and leading to the dissolution of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. This effectively put the nail in the coffin of the Confederacy and shaved perhaps a year or so off the total length of the war. Sherman easily assured his place in the history book through those deeds, but his life wasn't over. In today's video, we'll take a look at his post-war life and the legacy that he left behind when he did eventually die. Sherman's conservatism assured that he would not be sent south to oversee Reconstruction. Rather, he was sent west with headquarters in St. Louis. His command covered the territory west of the Mississippi and east of the Rocky Mountains, excluding Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. These were strained times for Sherman, his main joy coming from home life, where he indulged his children. His main problems involved the Indian Wars. He privately envied the natives' more free-willing lifestyle, yet he thought them naturally inferior, and he favored a hard policy. However, Sherman detested the predatory actions of the settlers, and in the case of the Utes and Navajo, he sided with them and protected them. One reason was that neither tribe struck a defiant pose or used violence. In Sherman's mind, he succeeded in avoiding mass bloodshed, and he was paving the way for progress, a view he took also of his Civil War activities. The nation mostly sided with Sherman, and two of his most capable subordinates in these wars, William Hazen and Philip Sheridan, became heroes of the day. This was how his role was seen until the late 20th century, when the fate of the natives has come to haunt our national consciousness. Sherman saw himself as saving the natives from annihilation while allowing America to grow and prosper. However, it is generally considered barbaric in our time. Even though Sherman's men avoided the massacres that were more common in pre-Civil War battles with native tribes, Sherman and his army still oversaw the final stages of the conquest of the natives that had been national policy since Andrew Jackson's presidency. Commanding General of the United States Army, Reformer. When Grant became president, he named Sherman as commander of all the armies, with plans to broaden its powers in what was a nebulous position. Sherman was wary of the assignment and almost turned it down. In the Senate, John Logan, still harboring a grudge, accused Sherman of wanting to carry out a military coup. Radicals decried his posting since they feared he might halt progress in Reconstruction. Southerners, by contrast, considered him a friend, and his stock rose in Dixie. In the disagreements between Sherman and Grant's Secretary of War, first John Rawlins, then William Belknap, Grant sided with his cabinet. At the same time, Grant favored a peace policy with the Plains tribes, and disapproved of Sherman's methods. Grant and Sherman drifted apart. Their relations became reserved, and Sherman disliked Grant's new affinity for radical politics and luxury. Thomas earned Sherman's sympathy and was given a major assignment, but died in 1870. Sherman's attempts to improve the Army's organization and officer training failed to go as far as he desired. The establishment of the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth and major reforms to the curriculum at West Point were his greatest successes. Sherman was part of the push toward professionalization, and he supported the careers of like-minded officers including Sheridan, Hazen, and Emory Upton. In the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, he supported a move from copying French and British trends toward German trends, although Sherman successfully adopted the French method of officer training. In Sherman, America had its first army commander who saw himself as a reformer and not a caretaker or mere administrator. He pointed the way toward the American army that would emerge in the 20th century, even more so than Winfield Scott and Ulysses Grant. Memoirs: The War for Remembrance and Reputation. Sherman's political inability and frustration caused him to retreat from the public. He took frequent vacations, including one to Europe, and made inspections as often as he dared. In a rather contentious move, he shifted his headquarters from Washington to St. Louis in 1874. The move was fortuitous in a sense, for Sherman's distaste for politics meant that he was not implicated in the scandals that rocked Grant's presidency, in particular those perpetrated by Belknap. In 1876, he returned to Washington and served until 1884. He could still court controversy, particularly when, along with George McClellan, he supported expanding the professional army as a means to break up labor strikes. By the time he retired in 1884, he was rather inactive, and his successor, Sheridan, made few improvements. However, the American army under Sherman had triumphed in the Modoc War, the Great Sioux War of 1876, and the Nez Perce War. Few of the tribes of the plains were left to oppose Western expansion, and most had gone to reservations. While Sherman did not plan these wars, he oversaw officer selection and approved the overall strategy of destroying native logistics. Much of Sherman's energy after 1874 was devoted to writing, editing, and defending his memoirs. Sherman was among the first to try his hand at crafting Civil War recollections. The book was a runaway success, in part because of Sherman's lively writing style. Sherman's opinions generated controversy. He often blamed his failures on others and had harsh words for even the war's best commanders, which annoyed Grant in particular. Most of all, Sherman's condemnation of the Southern cause meant his reputation there dropped. After his memoirs, he became the boogeyman of the lost cause, a kind of Yankee Mongol raider who defied all notions of civility. Sherman never batted an eye, later declaring, "How any Southern gentleman can still boast the lost cause or speak of it in language other than that of shame and sorrow passes my understanding." Although Sherman's memoirs made new enemies and strengthened old animosities, Sherman had won the war for memory with his prose and with his impressive intellect, two things even his worst critics would concede to him. His exploits, particularly in 1864 and 1865, became something of a legend in the Gilded Age. New York City, retired life. Even before leaving the Army, Sherman was already a highly sought speaker. But in the years after 1884, he was a particularly prominent orator. Much of this was an outgrowth of his time in Washington, where social visits were welcomed, particularly by young officers. Sherman was charitable to old soldiers and spoke to the first veterans organizations, particularly with the Society of the Army of the Tennessee. His speeches were varied. He often attacked the South and showed a softening view on race, including his gradual support for black suffrage, sparked in part by a rise in Southern laws that limited black freedoms. At one speech, delivered in Columbus, Ohio, he famously proclaimed, "There is many a boy here today who looks on war as all glory, but boys, it is all hell." It became his most quoted line, often shortened to, "War is hell." Another famous line was political. Upon being told that the Republican Party wanted him for president, he said simply, "I will not accept if nominated and will not serve if elected." This has ever since been known in politics as a Sherman reply. As his public life became gay and pleasant, his private life declined. His son Tom, expected to be a lawyer and carry the family traditions of professional success, instead turned to the Jesuits. Sherman, an avowed religious skeptic, was enraged, and he never quite forgave Ellen for raising the boy as a Catholic. Sherman had no right to be so unforgiving, however, because after 1864 he became interested in other women. He had confessed his newfound lust to Grant right after the war, and he earned a reputation as a rake, although his relatively discreet ways avoided scandal. He even made careful advances on one of Grant's daughters and upon Hazen's wife. One of his longest affairs was with Mary Audenried, wife of Joseph Audenried, a member of Sherman's staff. It began only after Joseph died, and perhaps in part because Mary was desperate for affection. An even longer affair was carried out with Vinnie Ream, an artist and freethinker. With these women, Sherman found intimacy, sex, and the kind of depth that Ellen lacked. These affairs are perplexing in part because Sherman had shown no great appetite for carnal pleasures before 1865. In those days, he was occupied more on attaining success as a young man. Once he arrived, so to speak, it was as if he were making up for lost time. Also, in being around Ellen Moore after 1865, he possibly found that they really had only a tenuous connection, bound more by the past than by common interest, hopes, and emotions. Death. Among the last great generals. Sherman lived in St. Louis for a time after the war, but it was mostly a base from which to travel the nation. In 1886, he settled in New York City, still a fixture in the lecture circuit. However, the years wore on. Although estranged from Grant, whose obsession with money disgusted Sherman, Sherman was saddened by the passing of his old friend. By 1886, he was among the last of the major Union generals still living. Sheridan, Thomas, Meade, and a host of others were already gone. Although still sharp, his mind was fading. Upon meeting Robert Louis Stevenson, he mistook him for a veteran and launched into some well-worn war stories. Ellen perished in 1888, and he was too aged to carry on affairs. Among his last public appearances was a West Point maneuver in 1889. On February 14, 1891, he died with pneumonia. He perished at the height of Civil War nostalgia, and, against his wishes, his funeral procession was an act of nationalistic pomp by an America confident and united. Joseph E. Johnston, who had befriended Sherman after the war, served as one of the pallbearers. He refused to wear a hat despite the rain, and died 1 month later. Sherman, in the meantime, was buried in St. Louis, a perfect middle ground for a man who drank the wide breadth of America. He saw his nation with his own eyes and fought for it. He died confident in its future, and that his actions had helped to secure a glorious national destiny. Sherman's family went on as best they could, but only one child, Rachel, bore children. Tom became depressed, and in 1911 he had a nervous breakdown. He died in seclusion in 1933. Philemon was a successful lawyer, but also a bachelor. John Sherman continued his political career, being a top Republican Party leader. He served as Secretary of Treasury under Rutherford B. Hayes and seemed poised for the presidency in 1880, but instead lost his bid due to the machinations of his very own campaign manager, James A. Garfield. Garfield was a political ally of William Tecumseh Sherman, but he was also an enemy of Ulysses S. Grant. As a veteran of the Army of the Cumberland, Garfield rightfully felt Grant and Sherman failed to give that organization its just accolades and possibly relished stopping both John Sherman and Grant from winning the nomination. Still, John Sherman pressed on, composing the famed Sherman Antitrust Act and serving disastrously as Secretary of State under William McKinley. John died in 1900. Hoyt, who was a successful banker, followed 4 years later. The Sherman family, once among the most respected in America, essentially faded from the upper rungs of power as the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era. The same fate also befell the Ewing clan, which by 1900 was no longer among the most powerful political families in America. Military reputation: prophet, master of maneuver, and monster. Even in his lifetime, Sherman's abilities as a general were the subject of debate. To the north, he was generally seen as an avenging angel and Grant's right hand of victory, his colorful quips and mannerisms adding to the luster of taking Atlanta and marching to the sea. In the South, he was, save for the period of Reconstruction, a thoroughly despised man. To them, Sherman was a brute who attacked innocents and robbed them of their rightful property, both human and inanimate. He also embarrassed the South by marching freely through the heartland, and his blunt words only made the wounds deeper. Even in denying that he had burned Columbia, he still said, "If I had made my mind to burn Columbia, I would have burned it with no more feeling than I would a common prairie dog village, but I did not do it." Sherman's admirers point to his strategic vision, mastery of logistics, and unwillingness to try frontal assaults after 1863. To the British military thinker Liddell Hart, Sherman was a forerunner of modern maneuver warfare. Sherman was extensively studied in military circles after World War I, as officers tried to avoid a repeat of Verdun. Others, damning war with Sherman's own language, see him as only the first step in the path to total war, where civilians are fair game. Both visions blow Sherman's role out of proportion. He was hardly a prophet of total war, or even maneuver tactics. Sherman's targeting of civilians was a practice that went back for centuries, and the Napoleonic Wars were certainly more total, as shown by the widespread devastation wrought in the Peninsular War. Also, Sherman had as many failures as he had successes. Tactically, his record was mixed, and he never scored victories on par with those secured by his friends, Grant and Thomas. Indeed, he never even met George Meade's achievement at Gettysburg by winning a battle of breathtaking scale and slaughter. Nor did he throw the enemy back in disarray as Sheridan did in the Shenandoah Valley and at Five Forks. However, Sherman was among the pivotal commanders of the war. He had a firm grasp of strategy and logistics, and his victory in Atlanta and then the March to the Sea were the decisive campaigns of the late war. My thoughts. A man between two worlds. Sherman once said, "Grant's whole character was a mystery even to himself, a combination of strength and weakness not paralleled by any of whom I have read in ancient or modern history." While Grant carries his own contradictions, the above applies more easily to Sherman. He was better at military affairs the further he was promoted. His empathy was limited by callousness to the degree that some claim he was a narcissist. Unlike most blunderers, he learned. The reporter Whitelaw Reid accurately observed that he never acknowledged an error and never repeated it. He was ambitious but unwilling to use his family connections unless forced to. He desired command but was conscious of his shortcomings and did not play army politics. Sherman's vices were legion. He was mostly an elitist and a bigot in terms of race and religion. He was not a great family man. He rarely took responsibility for failure, and his military errors are at times comically bad. Yet he did learn. He was honest in his speech and in private with himself. He was loyal, energetic, and above all intellectually curious and observant. On the eve of the Civil War, Sherman declared that the North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or pair of shoes can you make. You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth right at your doors. This is the key to Sherman's status as a good, if not great, general. He understood the logistics and mechanics of war. From here, one can see his desire to avoid frontal assaults, to embark upon the march to the sea, and his actions and utterances. War for him was not political, and even less spiritual. It was a materialistic and unromantic endeavor. In this he represented an emerging way of thought and action that was unique in 1864, but increasingly common by 1891. He was less a prophet of war and more a vanguard of a new kind of man, materialistic, relativistic, and direct. Sherman was both wholly of his time and yet unique. With Lee, one gets the feeling that he was an archetype even before he was cast in marble and put on a pedestal. Sherman has no such pretensions. One does not speak of false qualities with Sherman. Grant hid his arrogance and greed with his quiet and simple manner. Lee deflected his support for slavery and secession with statements about honor. Sherman, however, was blunt. His actions were rarely as harsh as his words, yet he rarely held back his feelings or opinions. It is perhaps this honesty and sharp eloquence combined with his struggles both internal and external that draws people to him. His personal struggles were even a running theme in Ross McElwee's bizarre slice-of-life documentary called Sherman's March. His struggles, both in his family and in finding a place in the world, seem modern even as his prejudices were wholly of his own time. Many damn the man, but I find it hard to hate the man.